I think yes, that these international human rights organizations are part of the problem with them is that, as you imply, that the agenda has grown uncontrolled. So we don't really know whether there is a human right to social welfare. You know, is there a human right to a roof over your head, or a human right to health? What would settle the question? Nobody knows. So, you know, I can obviously claim that I have a human right as a red-haired person to special privileges when traveling in places like this where there are so few of them. You know, and people do, but most people would laugh at it and say, no, that's ridiculous. But nevertheless, what are the grounds? Nobody knows. So that is part of the problem. There's an attempt to produce a kind of universal objective morality, but without any conception of where it comes from. The idea that people can't be judges in their own cause, of course, is universally accepted, only because everybody has an interest in their own cause other than its justice. You know, the fundamental idea of natural justice, at least in English law, is that a dispute between two people must be adjudicated by a third person who has no interest in either side. If you have no interest in the matter, only justice can motivate your decision. That's the idea. It is problematic. They have political agendas and all that, of course, and they get taken over by people who have a decided desire to reform whole societies. I mean, the European Union, the European Commission is very much characterized by this, because it is staffed by people who belong to essentially the transnational rootless elite, who don't actually have very many beliefs of a traditional kind, and are extremely irritated by the spectacle of a place like Poland and a place like Hungary. I mean, there's lots to be irritated about Hungary, no doubt. But, you know, the European Commission is the first to be irritated and will have reference to these vaguely defined human rights in order to make its position known. And that of course, can produce enormous resentment. I mean, it has produced resentment in certainly in my country and in Poland, and it will go on doing so.
Okay, let me ask another question. You're talking about the EU. So in the European Parliament, I think not long ago there was some sort of a decision made that you couldn't use gender distinctive terms in the document. So no monsieur, no madame, no Fräulein, whatever else. Is this, of course we know there are now folks who think of sort of different layers of gender. So you can be male-bodied or female-bodied, which is an anatomical thing, as opposed to your identity, which would then be male or female. So does this idea also originate in that gender is not something you can observe with a rational mind and sort of know what it is, but it really is about your identity, your judgment of yourself?
Well, yes, this is another issue. It's very easy for these transnational institutions like the European Parliament to respond to pressure groups of small organized people. You know, obviously radical feminists from France in this particular case. And those people probably wouldn't be able to force their views upon the whole public of France through the normal democratic process, because then they would come up against the fact that the French people don't want to to lose Monsieur, Madame, Mademoiselle, and so on. Right. This is one way in which elites impose their views on majorities by using these roundabout transnational institutions. Although in America, the elites use the Supreme Court in the same way to bypass ordinary people's feelings. This has been obvious in the case of abortion, that the standard New York liberal position on abortion was made into a nationwide orthodoxy through the Supreme Court. Okay, it's moving back the other way, but that's something that just does happen. Many people say, well, it doesn't matter. You know, what does it matter whether we drop the word monsieur, mademoiselle, or whatever? But it's a bit like what happened in Turkey in 1922, I think, when Ataturk said the Turkish language must no longer be written in Arabic script. It's got to be written in the Latin alphabet. That's much more sensible and straightforward, and then it'd be much easier to people to learn it from the Western countries, and we could relate to Western countries much more easily. And it had a fantastic effect. It changed Turkish society in a radical way, but it cut Turks off completely from their literary past. You know, nobody in Turkey today can read any of the classics, except a few, you know, highly educated people. Maybe that doesn't matter because the classics weren't any good, but I don't think that is true.
Right.
But in a similar way, but not less severely, American feminism, which is insisting on the feminine pronoun, is cutting off many people from the natural sense of the rhythm of English as used by those reactionary writers like Hume and Burke and even John Stuart Mill. That's a very good point. I don't think I've succeeded in defining moral relativism because I think it's so elusive a thing. One might say that a certain kind of conservatism which says that custom has a validity of its own, which is what you're saying, is very appealing. But it isn't a form of relativism because it is actually validating custom as such. It's saying, you know, custom does have a value, and that's the way we look for the solutions. And these solutions have emerged from people's interaction over generations, and that's why we should respect them. This is something that Burke said in his reflections on the French Revolution, and really he was speaking about a very objective moral truth. You know, that the answers to social questions are not invented, but discovered, and they're discovered over time through the people's interaction.
But of course, different people perhaps don't discover them, and maybe have bad customs.
Yeah,
so when for example, and noticing these differences among peoples, I guess, as old as history, because Herodotus famously noted differences in some of the African tribes and in Eurasia. So how do you then treat different customs if you recognize them to be somewhat morally
This is what the Enlightenment wanted to do, was to, as I said, to find that position outside specific customs from which they could all be judged. And the universal doctrine of human rights was supposed to be that position. And my view is that perhaps it is, as long as rights are treated in this purely negative way that the American founders treated them, and as Kant treated them, and really as Aquinas treated them. But when the doctrine of human rights starts escalating without any grounds, then all you're doing is imposing a new elite morality on people who can't possibly accept it. But there are problems. As we know, most of us feel that there are aspects of many of the Muslim societies that we are becoming familiar with these days, which we can't accept. You know, forced marriage, honor killing, even perhaps the constant concealing of women. You know, to us that is repugnant. But you know, there is a question in many people's minds: if you then just impose the Enlightenment liberal morality on these communities, are you doing them a service or not? Right. You know, there is a real conflict here, a conflict of values.
But of course, some of our customs they probably also think are repugnant.
Yes.
So then, what are we to do?
Well, the answer was that you know, to send them back home, but you can't say that. You have to say, no, we've got to live together as communities, and they are right to be repelled by, you know, pornography and all the things that they're repelled by in our communities, and we're right to be repelled by their treatment of women, right. And an accommodation over time might improve both of us.
Right. And on the same topic, in England, is the acceptance of certain forms of Sharia law within the British legal system, is that sort of a natural outgrowth of our wanting to treat their understanding of justice as similar or as equal to ours and as somehow compatible, even in the same nation?
No, because our nation is founded upon the rule of law, and this law has always been secular, and what the law is settled by Parliament and by the courts in obedience to Parliament. So to say that there should be a Sharia law adjudicated in parallel is effectively to deny that there is a unified nation. The Ottoman Empire lasted in this way for a long time, saying that that family affairs are adjudicated by Sharia if the family is Sunni Muslim, or by the canon law of the Catholic Church if they're Maronite, and so on, and the Orthodox jurisdiction of Constantinople for Athens, I think, yes, for the Greek Catholic, and so on, and they managed it, but they managed it only because there were no nations. It was an empire without borders. We have the view that the ultimate source of authority is the nation state defined by its borders. And within those borders, the law, the secular law as determined by Parliament, is the final authority. That's not just an arbitrary thing for us, that is the foundation of our obedience. And if a community grows up within those borders not accepting that, then it doesn't belong within those borders. And there's no other solution.
So by endorsing parallel legal systems, then they are in fact rejecting
the nation state.
That's
yeah.
Exactly right. Okay.
It doesn't follow from the fact that our obedience is to the rule of law that the law can just be anything. There are internal constraints. Not only the constraints of democratic election to Parliament, but the constraints of constitutions and of procedures embedded within the law. And the problem with Carl Schmitt, one of the many problems with Carl Schmitt, was that he had, yes, but he had this kind of extremism of the time, of those terrible years between the wars, where he just wanted to, to put a guillotine through everything. He said, at a certain stage it stops, and he says he is leader who has the voice in the final voice in a crisis. You know, that's for him. The crisis is what settles who is in authority, and we English always had the opposite view. In a crisis, that's when you should look for the authority that has come about in peacetime. You know, it's not the crisis that settles who is in authority, but the normal, peaceful dealings between people when there is no crisis. And the whole purpose of politics is to avoid crises. And on the whole, we English do avoid them very well. That's why we seem so complacent. And I think, you know, I think that's the same as true here. You know, that if you look back at people like Kelsen and so on, and the Austro-Hungarian tradition, although it's very different from the English, it is talking about the normal way of dealing with things and not the crisis. As I understand it, the Enlightenment conception of, well, there's no one Enlightenment conception, but the Enlightenment conception that the American Constitution embodies tries to set the state up as the thing which settles disputes. The thing which maintains the ongoing peaceable communion of people and represents their interests in the world as a whole, which means it doesn't in itself dictate to them all the axioms which they will need for day-to-day living. There is also a whole sphere of human life in which morality and religion play their part, but those spheres are not in themselves the sphere of the political. So there's a separation of the political sphere from the moral, and certainly from the religious. That's obviously famously so in the American case. It doesn't mean that the state doesn't in some oblique way depend on those spheres, that if people become completely demoralized and completely lose all religious sense, then of course it could be that the state also suffers you know, from that it's no longer able really to rely upon customs that it needed to rely upon in order to function. And I think that might be true. Humour is very important, and also satire of the opponent. You know, and it's very difficult because, as I was saying earlier, moral relativism has a tendency quickly to become a kind of absolutism of its own. You know, so that if you're making judgments or if you're revealing that you have some source of values which you regard as sacred or holy or outside this, you know, just personal choice, then people do start abusing you, and that's undeniably true. But in the long run, you know, you can stand up to that, and things change. People might abuse you as a fascist or whatever for 10 years, but you know, when the results of their worldview are being felt all around them, they might come back to saying, you know, she was right all along. You know, and that's. I mean, to a very small extent, I've had this experience. I was when I started coming out as a conservative around about 1980, It was to the immense shock of the academic establishment, and there were lots of. I had to sue people to, for libel for things that were said. There was a BBC programme with the sound of marching jackboots behind, somebody commenting on something I'd written. Everything was done to make it look as though this was the thin end of the fascist wedge. And for a long time I was very disheartened by it, and you can feel very, very distressed. But things have changed now, and a great many people think that possibly I wasn't just totally wrong about everything. And a certain rehabilitation comes about. I was sort of kept out of the British Academy, for instance, by all the old left establishment, Volheim and Williams and Isaiah Berlin and all that crowd. And then, they all died. I have to say, I was out of the country at the time, had nothing to do with it, they just died. And the next week I was made a Fellow of the British Academy, So that was a sure sign that perhaps things do change. That certainly is true. Obviously, we all have plenty of examples, like just basic human relations. Families are differently constituted, and yet can live side by side. Although still there might be a question of whether you have to be tolerant in order for this to happen. And toleration means perhaps accepting that your neighbour isn't living in the right way, but nevertheless it's not for you. You have no right to interfere, and that's the very normal position to take, I suspect, in Western societies. And we don't go through life thinking that every question is to be settled by a moral absolute. We are negotiating creatures, and that's especially true of us Europeans, because our systems of law emerge from negotiation. They're not dictated from on high by God, unlike the Sharia. They are the results of discussions over many hundreds of years, even in the English case, 1,000 years. So we're used to the idea that we don't settle all our questions by moral absolutes. But still, we might need some of those absolutes in order to begin.
It seems to me that maybe the worst outcome for a society that completely embraces moral relativism is just a reassertion of the idea that might is right, and sort of power politics. Do you agree with that, or is there a worse outcome?
There is. This is a quite interesting point. In the 1960s, when I wouldn't say the fall of man began then, but nevertheless, things did change, right, in a radical way. Very popular at the time was not just the relativistic morality of the student revolution, but the philosophy that rewrote morality as a system of power. Right. This is obviously Foucault was the most important person in this, and the basic argument in Foucault's writings, and it's an argument which comes ultimately from Marx, is that moral judgments have no intrinsic validity. They are part of ideology. whose reality has to be understood in terms of the power relations that they vindicate or endorse. To know what is being said by a moral judgment, you must go behind it, to discover the relations of power which are being concealed by it, and made to look legitimate. Once you think like that, you think that you have an absolute right to overthrow those relations of power, because they have no ground other than themselves, and with them overthrow the morality that goes with them. In Foucault's 4-volume Histoire de la sexualité, which I'm sure some of you know, you discover what this all at work, this overthrowing of every possible system of sexual morality as a mere legitimization of power relations, which in particular historical contexts. And that's been very influential, of course, on on the sexual behavior of half-educated adolescents. Not fully educated or completely uneducated, but the ones in between. Foucault, of course, is a very important thinker in that he's sort of made the postmodern world through this kind of way of thinking. Well, I understand the problem because obviously it's being talked about everywhere, and in particular the Hungarian situation. My view is that one should not look for political solutions to the problem that we've been discussing today. We're talking about something that goes to the heart of personal life and personal relations. It's as though the Enlightenment has finally come home to us, and what it means to us. And many people feel, that there's an urgent need, a worldwide need, to find some other foundation for the moral life than religion. Now, I'm skeptical that there really can be that other foundation, but certainly it can't be politics. One of the problems with communism is that it did try to provide an alternative foundation, not just for political order, but for the moral life, and to recruit everybody to a kind of militarized equality, which people have rejected because they've seen that it disenchanted human society completely, left people demoralized and in opposition to each other about everything. Harmony can come about, however, not through politics. It can only come about because people recognize the value of their own life and the value of the life of those around them. And that's something that has to be created through their own efforts.
Right. In America, a book called The Closing of the American Mind, the author talks about some of the effects of what you had mentioned, the pessimism and the skepticism, the dismissal of truth claims that came out of the 1960s. And he talks about it in the context of the university, such that students don't inquire after knowledge or seek after truth anymore. And he made a rather outrageous statement that he saw that as being somehow a worse situation than even the maybe religious wars that were happening in Europe. Do you think that's a little far-fetched, or is he trying to get at something that possibly embracing that sort of moral relativism and it eroding the foundations of justice or as laws we talked about previously in the case of Britain? It has somehow a deadly effect on civilization in the long run.
Yes. Well, there is a tendency of people in universities to think that what's going on in the university is what really matters. And that was the case with Bloom. When he was talking about the closing of the American mind, he really meant the fact that he couldn't talk to his students anymore. And outside the universities, there are all kinds of natural, normal Americans still existing, going about their business, going to church services. You know, America has remained a devout Christian society through all these things, at least if you're outside the cities. And also, if you're outside the universities, a basically decent society. So the fact is that it wasn't as bad as he thought. It was just bad for him.
Yeah.
But he had a point, because what he was saying was that that the relativism had made it impossible for him to teach the curriculum as though it had any objective authority. That was really what upset him. You know, you couldn't say to the student, look, here is Shakespeare, and just look, and here is Steinbeck, you know, just look. Surely you've got to see that first thing is not just better, but touching on the human reality in a deeper way. And the students would say, that's your view, you know, I've got my Bob Dylan, you know, and which is, you know, a million times better than what they have now. You know, there is a problem if you can't teach the old curriculum in the humanities because of this relativism. What are you going to teach students?
Right.
And increasingly, people teach pseudosciences instead. You know, the deconstructionist analysis of Steinbeck, or instead of teaching aesthetics, neuroaesthetics. You know, not knowing quite what that is. You know, it's Beethoven plus brain scans.
Well, is, after all, moral relativism that big of a problem? If it only amounts to maybe differences of opinions and occasional renegotiating of the political structure, is it really that big of a problem?
I would say that that we have to be much more careful of our institutions than moral relativists tend to be. Our values as Europeans come about through long-standing institutions. Here, as the gentleman said at the back, you know, communism destroyed the institutional superstructure, but it needs to be rebuilt. The example of Bloom and the closing of the American mind, I think, is significant because it has become difficult to maintain the dignity of the university in the times in which we live. Churches find it extremely difficult to maintain their teaching when anything goes, you know, traditional marriage, upon which the reproduction of society depends, as we all know, is under threat throughout the Western world, as you know, some supposedly arbitrary agreement between two adults to share each other's, or Kant said, a contract for the mutual use of the sexual organs. You know, Kant's view, Kant was obviously quite repelled by marriage, as you can imagine, but that's the view that is prevailing, and of course it leaves children out of consideration. Once you've left children out of consideration, things have come to an end.
Right.
They haven't yet, though. I've got two.
Don't leave us on quite such a pessimistic note, so there is hope.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all for coming tonight, and please join me in thanking Roger Scruton.